Air India Flight 171 crashed on June 12, 2025. Is this the result of an international conspiracy or simply an innocent mistake? Is Boeing to be blamed here, or is it a global conspiracy aided by Turkey or Pakistan? Stick around to find out. The Boeing 787 aircraft with registration number VTANB is preparing to take off from Sardar Patel International Airport in Gujarat. At 1:37 p.m. local time, the aircraft begins takeoff roll. 56 seconds after the wheels roll, the aircraft reaches V1, that is the takeoff decision speed. We will start counting time from the moment this speed is reached. 6 seconds, the plane becomes airborne. 9 seconds, the fuel supply to all engines of the plane is cut off. 14 seconds, the plane experiences a power shortage due to the shutdown of 2 engines, due to which the plane automatically deploys the ram air turbine to generate alternative power. It basically uses the kinetic energy of a moving plane to generate wind power. This helps to power hydraulics and flight control surfaces. 19 seconds, the fuel supply to engine 1 starts again. 23 seconds, the fuel supply to engine 2 starts. 32 seconds, realizing that a disaster is imminent, the doomed pilot sends a mayday signal to the ATC. ATC asks the crew to identify themselves, but before any response is received, the aircraft crashes. 38 seconds, enhanced airborne flight recorder, that is the black box, stops recording. Damages. The plane crashed into the BJ Medical College hostel, located at 1.5 kilometers from the airport. All the crew and passengers on board died except one. Amazingly, this lucky passenger survived with minor injuries and walked himself to the ambulance. According to many experts, he may have been able to save himself because his seat was near the emergency exit, seat 11A. In addition, 19 people on the ground were killed and 67 injured. The total death toll, including 241 souls on board, stands at 260. Cause of the accident: 9 seconds after reaching the takeoff decision speed, the fuel supply switch of both engines of this aircraft was turned off. Could this have happened automatically due to a technical defect from the manufacturer, or was it done by the pilots unintentionally? Let's address the theory that it was a button malfunction. In order for that, we need to look at an SAIB report published by Boeing and Federal Aviation Administration of USA back in 2018, and the preliminary report released by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau of India on 8th July 2025. According to that bulletin, the Boeing company received reports from operators of Model 737 airplanes that the fuel control switches were installed with the locking feature disengaged. If the locking feature is disengaged, the switch can be moved between the 2 positions without lifting the switch during transition, and the switch would be exposed to the potential of inadvertent operation. That is, there is a chance of accidental switch operation by the pilots. But this defect doesn't mean that the buttons can move by themselves. The switch in question here has a stop lock mechanism which involves a spring. The presence of this spring lock ensures that the switch needs to be pulled out or lifted before it can be thrown up or down. Without being pulled out first, it will not move from its place. If the case of Air India 171 is as the bulletin claims, then the fuel control switches would have been installed without the locking feature, that is, without the spring-loaded stop lock mechanism. That means it could be thrown up or down without being pulled out first. Such a defect would have been obvious to any pilot who had flown the aircraft even once, and he would have immediately reported this. But in the aircraft's total life of 41,868 flight hours, such a complaint was never filed by either the pilots or the engineers. Not only that, the switches along with the thrust control panel on which they rest were replaced twice on the aircraft in question, once in 2019 and again in 2023. This can be seen in the preliminary report toward the end of Section 4. This report completely rules out button malfunction by explicitly stating there has been no defect reported pertaining to the fuel control switch since 2023 on VTANB. VTANB is the registration number of the aircraft in question. So, the button malfunction theory is invalid. Now let's address the theory that the pilot unintentionally turned off the switch. To that end, we must take a closer look at the fuel control switches. The switches have two safety systems. There is a metal bracket on each side of the switches that can prevent unintentional operation of the switch. Also, this switch is locked by a spring. It needs to be pulled out before it can be thrown up or down. Without being pulled out first, it will not move from its place. In such a situation, it is not possible for the pilot to accidentally turn off even one switch. But in this flight, both switches were cut off. This can only be done intentionally. Now, the unintentional switch operation theory is also invalid. So that leaves us with only one viable theory: intentional fuel cutoff by the pilot. The evidence found in the preliminary report leaves no room for any other possibility. Hence, this crash is most likely a case of kamikaze or suicide by pilot. Such incidents, although rare in the history of aviation, are not unprecedented. Below is a list of such incidents. The main reason behind these incidents is the mental health of the pilot. Because it is not usually possible for a healthy person to commit suicide, and on top of that, it is even more unusual to die with hundreds of passengers on board and innocent people on the ground. The initial reports state that one pilot can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder saying to the other, "Why did you cut off?" To which the other replies, "I did not do it." But this report does not state which voice belongs to whom. However, the CVR has clear records of which voice came from which mic, which makes it clear which voice belongs to the captain and which to the first officer. That is, the Accident Investigation Bureau deliberately left out this key piece of information. It is our assumption that they intentionally left this detail out to spare the families of the deceased pilots. The bereaved family members of the victims of this crash might engage in mob violence against them, so the report willfully steers away from assigning any blame to any single pilot or revealing any information that may lead people to pinpoint the criminal. However, in light of aviation standard practices, we can say that the pilot monitoring this flight naturally becomes the person of interest in this crime, because under these practices, the pilot flying usually has both hands on the control column of the aircraft. According to FDR, the fuel supply switch was cut off only 3 seconds after the aircraft became airborne. In that case, it would not be possible for the pilot flying to turn off those two switches at that moment because both his hands were at the wheels. So, the arrow of suspicion naturally falls on the pilot monitoring. The pilot monitoring this flight was 56-year-old Captain Sumit Sabharwal. According to this hypothesis, it is Captain Sumit who asks, "Why did you cut off?" That is, he is the one who turned off the switch, taking advantage of the fact that the first officer, Clive, was preoccupied with the control column. Add to this the absence of a camera in the cockpit, which makes it easier for him to play the clueless victim. Later, he is the one who turned on this switch again and made the futile attempt to save the plane, knowing full well that restarting the engine at that moment would not be of any use. And later, he is the one who sent the Mayday signal to the ATC. So why are people blaming Boeing? Boeing has a track record of blaming innocent pilots, especially Indian pilots, after an air crash. In the Lion Air crash of 2018, they famously blamed Captain Bhavya Suneja of India for the disaster when they themselves were responsible. So it was natural for people to assume that they had done the same thing this time. But in reality, it wasn't so. In this case, the pilot was to blame. It's a classic case of the boy who cried wolf. Finally, it can be said that it is a great blessing that neither the pilots nor the lone survivor involved in this accident was a Muslim. Otherwise, India's biased media would have tried to link it to the Indo-Pak War of 2025 by painting it with a communal brush. Many Indians have already taken to blaming Muslim nations like Turkey or Pakistan. Due to this mindset, there was a chance of riots breaking out all over India. Miraculously, the plane missed hitting an Indian army installation just by a few hundred meters from the crash site. If the news of Muslim pilots hitting a military installation with kamikaze attacks had spread in India, it would have become the second 9/11. If the plane hit the military hospital and the survivor happened to be a Muslim, similar rumors would have spread like wildfire, resulting in mass anarchy not only across India, but also the rest of South Asia. However, these 260 lives could have been saved if the altitude of the plane had been slightly higher when the fuel switches were turned off. But the killer deliberately turned off the switch at a time when there was no way out. Only a fiery grave would be their final destination.